Carlos II, the young and sickly king of Spain, died at 33. Even worse, with no hair. By the standards of the time, this meant that the great powers of Europe were to fight for their candidates' right to the throne. Last episode, we covered the state of Europe and the cause of the War of the Spanish Succession in greater detail. Today, the fighting begins. In the north, the Duc de Boufflers and the Duc de Tallard were assigned to seize control of the Spanish Netherlands against the Duke of Marlborough. On the Rhine, Claude de Villars, after a frustrating command under Marshal Cadiz in Italy, had been given his own independent command against the Imperial Marshal Louis von Baden and the Count of Styrum with the Marshal Villeroy. In Italy, Prince Eugen of Savoy almost immediately began to march against the Duc de Vendôme. The French seized the barrier fortresses of the Spanish Netherlands and linked up with the Spanish units there. Boufflers, a man with great reputation for his courage and bravery in previous wars, took initiative. On the Rhine, Villeroy remained indecisive and camped his army to wait for extra supplies and reinforcements. Indecisiveness like this would cost the French far more than some additional taking ground in the near future. Von Baden moved to capture Haguenau and Wissembourg, finally laying siege to Landau. Villars heavily criticized Martin's inaction, writing a letter to the king himself to grant him an independent command. Louis XIV gave orders to Villars to lead a penetrating army into the empire. Claude de Villars joined the Mousquetaires du Roi in 1671. From there he gained experience in the Franco-Dutch War and the War of the Grand Alliance. Since then he was known for going against command if it meant a decisive victory. Time and time again he was pardoned, but looked down upon by higher nobility. Villars was very well respected by his men, compared to other marshals. Villars was one of the few men who seemed to care about them. His ambition and undimmed courage, a highlight of his character. Villars was to strike the Imperials and reach Maximilian's 20,000 Bavarians in hopes of capturing the imperial capital of Vienna. Such a move was beyond daring during the time period of Villars, but his ambition would carry him on. Villars did not approve of a war of siege, and so sallied out with his army. However, the plan already began to fall apart. Prince Louis had thrown back an attempt by the Count of Arcot to reach Villars. Even better for Prince Louis, the garrison of Landau capitulated on the 12th of September. He was now free to move. Louis XIV finally kicked Cadiz into action. He would not abandon his German allies. Villars received more detachments from Cadiz and moved to Groningen, which he arrived on the 28th. The Rhine is just up ahead. Their end was defended by Fort Friedlingen, with its redoubts heavily garrisoned. Villars quietly placed engineers, covered by 2 infantry battalions on the island, to repair the fortifications. The infantry kept the engineers safe, along with the cannon from Groningen. The bridge was completed by October 2nd. In order to aid the engineers, the infantry irregularly attacked and harassed the Imperials on the other side of the Rhine. Villars ordered a second bridge to be constructed at Nuremberg. Baden moved forces from the opposite of the Groningen to meet the French crossing the second bridge. Villars' army had crossed, forming from column to line.
In truth, sir, the armies of the king are well-trained, numerous, filled with valor, and ready to give battle to his majesty's enemies. I wish to take the liberty of saying nothing is impossible for these men. For such men, the primary and only action is to meet the enemy on the field of battle.
Immediately, grenadiers attacked the Imperials opposite of Groningen, dislodging its defenders. Villars put the finishing touches on his line. The French infantry attacked the Great Barbers. The Imperials fled amongst heavy hand-to-hand fighting. Meanwhile, on the plain, von Baden himself led 36 squadrons to attack de Magnac's cavalry, who countercharged, but halted as Baden's horsemen became disorganized from a long dash. When the enemy was in 500 paces, de Magnac charged. Baden fell back, but de Magnac did not proceed. Meanwhile, in the woods of Tübingen, the infantry attack took a turn for the best for von Baden. Bayonet fighting had developed there. The Imperials gradually reformed. Was the French resembled, to quote author Claude Sturgill, a herd of sheep rather than an army. The French were taken by complete surprise and began to rout. Villars rode up to the fleeing men and shouted words of encouragement and picked up a French staff. He cried, "Where is your courage? The battle is already won. Cry with me, Vive le Roi!" Almost instantly, the French lines began to reform and pressed on the attack. The heavily outnumbered Imperials could only retreat from the field. That same evening, Fort Friedlingen capitulated after a scaling assault from the French. The French suffered over 4,000 casualties, largely due to the intense bayonet combat in the woods. The Imperials lost slightly less at 3,700 casualties, putting up a decent defense despite having 3,000 less men than the Villars. Villars nonetheless delivered a good blow to the Imperials, and delivered the first French victory of the war. He was promoted from lieutenant general to marshal. Lack of cooperation from the Bavarians may have saved the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. Meanwhile, a year earlier in Italy, Marshal Catinat did not share the same luck. Catinat initially was able to occupy the strong positions above Verona, on the Rivoli d'Afil. Catinat thought himself safe from any current attack, as he drew in men and supplies, as the land to the east was under control of neutral Venice. Eugen, however, gained the trust of the Venetian authorities, and rode out with his army, utilizing paths never used since the time of Charles V. Eugen's Imperials were already on the plains by the May 28th. Marshal Catinat was taken by complete surprise. He made the mistake of spreading his men thin, all the way to the south in the possessions of the Po. 5 weeks later, Eugen began an attack, driving a small French cavalry corps from their positions. Catinat realized Eugen had no intention of attacking the Po, and retreated behind the Oglio River. Eugen had already driven the indecisive Catinat back, with very little of any fight. Catinat was stripped from command, and Marshal Villeroy was placed in command in September of 1701. Though Villeroy ignored the warnings that Eugen had fortified in strong positions. The Franco-Spanish infantry attacked without their commander realizing the situation, and with devastating fire from the entrenched Imperials, were driven back, with the army a mile further away on the same side of the Oglio. 1701 ended in failure for the Bourbons. Although the Imperial army suffered the same problems of disease and lack of supplies, they had already gained an advantage in the campaign. Regardless, Eugen attacked one last time at Villeroy's headquarters in Cremona, before both armies could set camp for the winter. Afterwards, the French would win a minor victory at Santa Vittoria, but this didn't set Eugen back. The Italian campaign would remain stagnant until 1705. Meanwhile, in Spain, the Allies, led by Admiral Rooke and the Duke of Ormond, initially blundered with a poorly executed landing around the city of Cadiz. The Spanish commander, the Marquis de Villadarias, cut off the communications of the Allied units and harassed the Allied detachments. The defenders held out for the time being. It was rather humiliating, as the Allies numbered around 14,000 men, whilst the Spaniards had around 450 men readily available to deploy, though there was no heavy fighting between the two armies. The expedition also failed to bring Spanish nobles to the Habsburg cause. The plundering and looting of the city of Rota did nothing to help the image of Archduke Charles. But luckily for the Allies, a Franco-Spanish silver fleet arriving from the Americas under Chateau Renaud and Manuel de Velasco was intercepted by Rooke in the Battle of Vigo Bay. The results for the Bourbons were disastrous. Nearly all ships of the fleet were burnt or captured, with 2,000 men lost in the fighting, whilst the Allies had lost 0 ships and just 800 men. However, the Allies had lost the opportunity to capture most of the valuables on board. The silver had already been almost completely unloaded, and half, around 7 million pesos worth of silver, would be kept in Spanish hands. The success of the battle did bring much confidence in the alliance to the Portuguese, which now entered the war on the side of the Allies. Subscribe and stay tuned for the next episode. I'll be covering more fronts and theaters of the war, including the Americas. Next episode, we cover the events of 1703 as we approach one of the most important battles in modern history.